The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the bustling airport terminal. Travelers of all ages and backgrounds hurried to their respective gates, dragging suitcases behind them or clutching boarding passes tightly in their hands. Among these passengers was Marcus, a 17-year-old boy with a warm smile and an easygoing demeanor. He had just finished his shift at a local cafe near the airport and was now heading home to spend the evening with his family. His dark hoodie was pulled up against the chilly air conditioning, and his backpack hung loosely over one shoulder as he walked toward Gate 23. Marcus wasn't particularly excited about this flight. It was just another routine trip back home, after work. But he still felt a small sense of satisfaction knowing that he'd earned the ticket himself. Working part-time at the cafe had taught him responsibility, and saving money for little luxuries like plane tickets made him feel independent. As he approached the gate, he glanced around at the other travelers, businessmen typing furiously on laptops, families trying to keep restless children entertained, couples whispering quietly to each other. Everything seemed perfectly normal. When it was finally time to board, Marcus handed his ticket to the flight attendant with a polite nod and stepped onto the aircraft. The interior smelled faintly of leather seats and cleaning products, a familiar scent that reminded him of previous trips. He found his assigned seat near the window, a spot he always preferred because it gave him a perfect view of the world below during takeoff and landing. Settling into the cushioned chair, Marcus placed his backpack under the seat in front of him and pulled out his phone. Plugging in his earphones, he scrolled through his playlist until he found something calming enough to help him relax during the short journey ahead. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Richard Hayes adjusted his uniform collar and reviewed the pre-flight checklist. A seasoned pilot in his mid-40s, Richard prided himself on his professionalism and attention to detail. With over 2 decades of experience flying commercial planes, he believed he had seen it all, or so he thought. As he prepared for takeoff, he glanced casually toward the cabin through the partially open cockpit door. His eyes scanned the rows of passengers, ensuring everything appeared orderly. But then something caught his eye. A young man sitting near the middle of the plane wearing a hoodie and looking relaxed, almost too casual for Richard's liking. Richard frowned slightly. The teenager's posture struck him as odd, slouched in his seat, scrolling through his phone without paying much attention to his surroundings. To Richard, the boy looked out of place, though he couldn't quite explain why. Perhaps it was the way the hood partly obscured his face, or maybe it was the fact that most other passengers were dressed more formally for travel. Whatever it was, Richard's mind began racing with possibilities. In today's world where safety concerns dominated headlines, he couldn't afford to ignore even the smallest red flags. Without giving it much thought, Richard reached for the intercom system and quietly contacted airport security. "We've got a situation here," he said in a low voice, careful not to alarm anyone nearby. "There's a passenger who seemed suspicious. Seat 15C. Could you send someone to check it out?" On the other end of the line, the security team acknowledged his request and assured him they would handle it discreetly. Back in the cabin, Marcus remained oblivious to the chain reaction his mere presence had set off. He tapped his foot gently to the rhythm of the song playing in his ears, completely unaware that his relaxed demeanor had triggered such scrutiny. Around him, other passengers continued their usual routines, reading books, chatting quietly, or dozing off in preparation for the upcoming flight. No one paid any special attention to the teenager in the hoodie, except for Richard, whose suspicions only grew stronger with each passing minute. It wasn't long before 2 uniformed officers appeared at the entrance of the plane. They moved swiftly down the aisle, their boots clicking softly against the floor. Passengers turned their heads curiously, wondering what was happening. When the officers stopped beside Marcus, one of them tapped him lightly on the shoulder. Startled, Marcus removed his earphones and looked up, confusion etched across his face. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice calm but tinged with uncertainty. The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured for Marcus to gather his belongings and follow them off the plane. Feeling uneasy but unwilling to cause a scene, Marcus complied. He grabbed his backpack and stood up, glancing around at the sea of curious eyes watching him leave. Some passengers whispered among themselves, speculating about what might have gone wrong. Others simply stared, their expressions ranging from concern to judgment. Marcus tried to maintain his composure, though inside, he felt a growing knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. Once outside the plane, the officers led Marcus to a quiet corner near the gate. One of them held up a hand, signaling for him to stop. "Can we see some ID, please?" the taller officer asked, his tone firm but not unkind. Marcus nodded and reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. He handed over his driver's license, which the officer examined closely. Meanwhile, the second officer peppered him with questions. Where was he traveling to? Why was he taking this particular flight? Did he have any connections to the airline staff? Marcus answered truthfully, explaining that he worked at a cafe nearby and was simply returning home after finishing his shift. But the officers didn't seem entirely convinced. Their probing questions continued, each one making Marcus feel smaller and more vulnerable. For the first time, he began to realize that this wasn't just a random check. It was something deeper, something rooted in assumptions he couldn't control. And yet he kept his cool, determined not to let frustration get the better of him. As the interrogation dragged on, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was being judged not for anything he had done, but for how he looked. The hoodie, the backpack, the music, none of it mattered except in the context of someone else's prejudice. He clenched his fists briefly, then forced himself to relax. If there was one thing his mother had taught him, it was to stay strong in the face of adversity. Little did he know she was about to make an appearance that would change everything, for both him and the people involved in this unfolding drama. As Marcus stood there, surrounded by the cold sterility of the airport corridor, his frustration began to simmer beneath the surface. The officers' questions felt endless, circling back to the same points without offering him a chance to truly explain himself. "I already told you," he said, his voice steady but tinged with irritation. "I'm just going home. I work at the cafe down the street. You can call them if you want." But the officers didn't seem interested in verifying his story. Instead, they exchanged skeptical glances, as though his answers only deepened their suspicions. Passers-by occasionally slowed down to glance at the scene unfolding near Gate 23. Some whispered to each other, speculating about what might have happened. A few shook their heads disapprovingly, assuming Marcus must have done something wrong. After all, why else would security be questioning him? Others simply walked past, too preoccupied with their own travel plans to give it much thought. For Marcus, this was perhaps the hardest part, being judged not for who he was but for how others perceived him based on appearances. The taller officer crossed his arms and leaned slightly forward, his tone sharpening. "Why were you sitting so casually on the plane? Didn't you notice the pilot watching you?" Marcus blinked, caught off guard by the question. "What does that even mean?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "I was just listening to music. Am I supposed to sit stiff and scared because someone's looking at me?" His words hung in the air unanswered. It was clear that no matter what he said, the officers weren't ready to let him go. Not yet, anyway. Just as Marcus was starting to feel like things couldn't get worse, a woman strode purposefully toward the group. She moved with authority, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. Her presence commanded attention instantly. Heads turned as people tried to figure out who she was and why she seemed so determined. Dressed in a sleek navy blue suit with a crisp white blouse, she radiated confidence and professionalism. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her sharp eyes scanned the situation before focusing squarely on the officers. "Excuse me," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "What is going on here?" All eyes shifted to her, including Marcus's. He recognized her immediately. It was his mother, Evelyn Carter. Relief washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by anger. Seeing her there reminded him of how unfair this entire ordeal had been. How dare these strangers treat him like a criminal when he hadn't done anything wrong? The officers straightened up, visibly startled by her sudden appearance. One of them cleared his throat and began explaining hesitantly. "Ma'am, We received a report from the pilot about, suspicious behavior from this passenger. We're just conducting routine checks to ensure everyone's safety." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, unimpressed by their vague explanation. "Suspicious behavior?" she repeated, her tone dripping with skepticism. "Care to elaborate? Because from where I'm standing, my son looks like any other teenager waiting to board a flight." Her words struck a nerve. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable under her intense gaze. Before they could respond further, Evelyn turned her attention to Marcus. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her expression softening as she placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Marcus nodded, though his clenched jaw betrayed the frustration still bubbling inside him. "Yeah, Mom, I'm fine," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. Evelyn squeezed his shoulder gently, silently promising him that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Evelyn then turned her piercing gaze back to the officers. "Do you realize who this boy is?" she demanded, her voice rising slightly. "Or are you so blinded by your assumptions that you didn't bother to check?" The officers looked bewildered, unsure how to respond. At that moment, the pilot appeared, drawn by the commotion. Richard Hayes approached cautiously, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. When he saw Evelyn, his eyes widened in shock. He recognized her immediately. How could he not? Her face had been featured in countless industry magazines and news articles. She was Evelyn Carter, founder and CEO of Airlines, the very company operating the flight Marcus had been removed from. Richard froze, his mind racing as he realized the gravity of his mistake. Not only had he accused an innocent teenager of wrongdoing, but that teenager happened to be the son of one of the most powerful figures in aviation. Evelyn fixed him with a steely glare, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Captain Hayes," she said coolly, using his name to emphasize her familiarity with his role. "Would you care to explain why you flagged my son as suspicious? Was it his hoodie? His music? Or was it simply the color of his skin?" The question hit like a thunderclap, silencing everyone within earshot. Richard stammered, struggling to find the right words. "Ms. Carter, I assure you, I had no idea." He trailed off, unable to meet her gaze. Evelyn cut him off sharply. "No idea? That's exactly the problem. You acted on impulse, letting your biases dictate your actions instead of facts. And now, because of your recklessness, my son has been humiliated in front of dozens of people." Her words carried weight, resonating not only with the officers and the pilot but also with the growing crowd of onlookers. Passengers who had initially dismissed the incident as unremarkable now watched intently, realizing the deeper implications of what had transpired. Evelyn stepped closer to Richard, her voice lowering but retaining its intensity. "Let me make one thing clear," she said. "This isn't just about Marcus. This is about every person who has ever been judged not by their character or actions, but by the way they look. Your job is to ensure the safety of your passengers, not to profile them based on stereotypes." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He stood there, speechless, his face flushed with shame. The officers, sensing the shift in power dynamics, took a step back, unsure of what to do next. Evelyn turned to address the crowd that had gathered around them. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice strong and unwavering, "what happened here today is unacceptable. No one deserves to be treated this way. Not my son, not anyone. Racism and prejudice have no place in our society, especially in industries like aviation, which are meant to connect people, not divide them." Her impassioned speech drew murmurs of agreement from the audience. Some nodded in solidarity, while others clapped quietly, moved by her words. Evelyn's presence transformed the chaotic scene into a moment of reflection. Even Marcus, who had been seething with anger moments earlier, felt a glimmer of hope. Watching his mother stand up for him, and for others like him, was both humbling and empowering. With the situation diffused, Evelyn instructed the officers to escort Marcus back to the plane. "He's coming with me," she added firmly, leaving no room for argument. As they walked away, leaving Richard and the officers behind, whispers rippled through the crowd. Many wondered how such a high-profile incident would play out in the days to come. Would there be consequences for the pilot? Would the airline take steps to prevent similar incidents in the future? For now, however, the focus remained on Evelyn and Marcus, whose quiet strength spoke volumes. Once they were safely seated in first class, a courtesy extended by a flustered flight attendant, Evelyn turned to Marcus. "I'm so sorry this happened to you," she said, her voice filled with genuine regret. Marcus shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant, but his eyes betrayed the hurt he still felt. "It's not your fault, Mom," he replied softly. "But thanks for showing up. I don't know what I would have done without you." Evelyn smiled faintly, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "You're stronger than you think, Marcus. Don't ever forget that." As the plane taxied down the runway and lifted into the sky, mother and son sat together in silence, each lost in their thoughts. The events of the day had left an indelible mark on both of them, but it was also a reminder of the resilience and courage required to confront injustice head-on. And though the road ahead promised challenges, Evelyn knew one thing for certain. She would stop at nothing to protect her son and fight for a world where such incidents became a thing of the past. The plane soared above the clouds, its engines humming steadily as passengers settled into their seats for the remainder of the flight. For Marcus, however, the tension in the air was palpable. Though he sat beside his mother in first class, stark contrast to the cramped economy section he'd been assigned earlier, he couldn't shake the weight of what had just happened. His hoodie still hung loosely around his shoulders, but it no longer felt like a comfortable garment. Instead, it seemed to symbolize everything that had gone wrong that day. Evelyn, too, was lost in thought. Her sharp eyes scanned the cabin intermittently, taking note of the curious glances from other passengers. Some looked away quickly when they realized she was watching them, while others held her gaze, perhaps recognizing her from news articles or industry events. She could almost read their thoughts. That's Evelyn Carter, the woman who confronted the pilot. The whispers were inevitable, and she knew this incident would dominate headlines by morning. But none of that mattered to her right now. What mattered most was ensuring her son felt safe and respected. As the minutes passed, Evelyn leaned closer to Marcus, her voice soft but firm. "I need you to tell me exactly how you're feeling," she said, her tone leaving no room for evasion. Marcus hesitated, unsure where to begin. How could he put into words the frustration, embarrassment, and anger swirling inside him? Finally, he sighed and looked down at his hands, which were clenched tightly together. "I don't get it, Mom," he admitted quietly. "Why does everyone always assume the worst about me? I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just existing." His words struck a chord deep within Evelyn. She nodded slowly, understanding all too well the pain of being judged unfairly. Growing up, she had faced similar challenges, though hers often came wrapped in sexism as well as racism. As a young black woman climbing the ranks in a predominantly white, male-dominated industry, she had learned early on that proving herself wasn't enough. People would always find reasons to doubt her abilities, question her motives, or dismiss her achievements. But unlike her son, she hadn't had someone to step in and defend her back then. That was why today's confrontation meant so much, not just for Marcus, but for every person who had ever been made to feel small because of prejudice. "I know it's not fair," Evelyn replied gently, placing a hand on his arm. "And I wish I could shield you from moments like this, but I can't. What I can do is teach you how to rise above it, to show the world that their assumptions don't define you." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, reflecting the resolve that had carried her through countless obstacles in her own life. "You are more than your hoodie, Marcus. You are more than their stereotypes. Don't let anyone make you forget that." Marcus nodded silently, absorbing her words. He wanted to believe her, to trust that one day the world might see him for who he truly was, rather than reducing him to a caricature based on skin color or clothing choices. But the scars of the afternoon were still fresh, and healing wouldn't come easily. Still, having his mother beside him gave him strength. If anyone could turn this painful experience into something meaningful, it was Evelyn Carter. Meanwhile, back in the cockpit, Captain Richard Hayes wrestled with his own emotions. The confrontation with Evelyn replayed in his mind over and over. Again, each memory sharpening the sting of shame he felt. He had spent years building a reputation as a competent, reliable pilot, one who prioritized safety above all else. Yet in a single moment of poor judgment, he had allowed bias to cloud his decision-making. Worse still, his actions had directly impacted not only Marcus but also Evelyn, whose leadership and vision had revolutionized the aviation industry. Richard gripped the controls tightly, his knuckles whitening under the pressure. He glanced toward the open cockpit door, half expecting Evelyn to appear once more and demand answers. But the aisle remained empty, save for the occasional flight attendant passing by with refreshments. Despite the physical distance between them, Richard couldn't escape the mental image of Evelyn's piercing gaze boring into him, demanding accountability. He knew he couldn't undo what had happened, but he also understood that an apology wouldn't suffice, not after such a public humiliation. By the time the plane touched down at its destination, word of the incident had already begun spreading among airport staff. Ground crew members whispered to each other as passengers disembarked, pointing discreetly toward Marcus and Evelyn. Reporters stationed near the terminal caught wind of the story and rushed to gather details, hoping to break the news before competitors did. Within hours, social media platforms lit up with hashtags like #TAR Justice for Marcus and #AR End Racial Profiling in Aviation, amplifying calls for change across the industry. Evelyn wasted no time addressing the growing attention. Before leaving the airport, she paused briefly to speak with journalists gathered outside. Surrounded by flashing cameras and microphones thrust in her direction, she stood tall, exuding the same composure she had displayed earlier during the confrontation. "What happened today is a reflection of systemic issues we've ignored for far too long," she began, her voice steady and commanding. "It's not just about my son. It's about every individual who has been profiled, marginalized, or treated unjustly because of their race, gender, or socioeconomic status." Her statement resonated deeply with those listening, both in person and online. Many praised her courage and transparency, calling her a beacon of hope in a world rife with inequality. Others criticized the airline industry for failing to address these problems sooner, urging companies to implement stricter policies against racial profiling. Evelyn didn't shy away from the criticism. In fact, she welcomed it. To her, accountability was key to driving meaningful change. Once home, Evelyn sat down with Marcus to discuss next steps. She explained that while the incident was undoubtedly painful, it presented an opportunity to spark important conversations about bias and inclusivity. "We can't change the past," she said, "but we can shape the future, and I want you to be part of that." Together, they brainstormed ideas for advocacy initiatives, including workshops aimed at educating airline employees about implicit bias and creating mentorship programs for young people interested in careers in aviation. Over the following weeks, Evelyn threw herself into these efforts, leveraging her influence to push for reform. She partnered with civil rights organizations, collaborated with industry leaders, and even testified before Congress about the need for greater diversity and equity in transportation. Her testimony garnered widespread acclaim, further cementing her status as a trailblazer committed to dismantling barriers for marginalized communities. For Marcus, the aftermath of the incident proved transformative in ways he hadn't anticipated. Initially reluctant to share his story publicly, he eventually agreed to participate in interviews and panel discussions alongside his mother. Speaking out wasn't easy. Each retelling reopened old wounds, but it also reminded him of his resilience. Slowly but surely, he began to embrace his role as an advocate, using his voice to challenge stereotypes and inspire others facing similar struggles. The ripple effects of that fateful day extended far beyond Marcus and Evelyn. Across the country, airlines began reevaluating their training protocols, incorporating modules on cultural sensitivity and anti-discrimination practices. Employees attended mandatory workshops designed to foster empathy and understanding, learning firsthand how biases could harm individuals and tarnish reputations. While progress was gradual, the shift marked a significant step forward in addressing long-standing inequalities within the industry. Even Captain Richard Hayes found himself profoundly changed by the experience. After issuing a heartfelt public apology, he enrolled in diversity training courses and volunteered to mentor junior pilots on ethical decision-making. Though rebuilding trust took time, his willingness to confront his mistakes earned him cautious respect from colleagues and passengers alike. Months later, as Evelyn reflected on the journey they had embarked upon, she felt a sense of quiet pride. The road ahead remained fraught with challenges, but she knew they were moving in the right direction. For Marcus, the ordeal had transformed from a source of pain into a catalyst for growth, a reminder that even in moments of injustice, there was power in standing up and speaking out. Together, mother and son had turned adversity into action, proving that sometimes the hardest battles yield the greatest victories. The days following the incident at the airport felt like a whirlwind for Marcus and Evelyn. While the media coverage brought attention to their story, it also amplified the emotional toll of reliving the event over and over again. Every interview, every article, every social media post seemed to dig deeper into the wound, forcing Marcus to confront the raw reality of what had happened. Yet, with each retelling, he grew more confident, not just in his ability to articulate his feelings, but also in his conviction that this moment could be transformative. Evelyn, meanwhile, worked tirelessly behind the scenes. She wasn't content with merely addressing the issue publicly. She wanted tangible change within her own airline and beyond. Her first step was calling an emergency meeting with Skyline Airlines' executive board. The room buzzed with tension as executives filed in, some visibly uneasy about the scrutiny they were under. Evelyn wasted no time cutting through the formalities. "What happened to my son isn't an isolated incident," she began, her voice firm yet measured. "It's a symptom of a larger problem, one we have ignored for far too long." She went on to outline a bold plan: mandatory diversity training for all employees, from pilots and flight attendants to ground staff and management. These sessions wouldn't be optional or superficial check-the-box exercises. They would be immersive, thought-provoking experiences designed to challenge biases and foster empathy. Additionally, she proposed creating a dedicated task force to investigate complaints of racial profiling and ensure accountability. "We need to hold ourselves to a higher standard," she declared. "If we don't lead by example, who will?" The board members exchanged wary glances, aware that implementing such sweeping changes would require significant resources. But none dared to argue with Evelyn, not when her resolve was so unwavering. By the end of the meeting, they unanimously approved her proposals, knowing resistance would only damage the company's reputation further. For Evelyn, this victory was just the beginning. She envisioned a future where airlines became models of inclusivity and fairness rather than symbols of systemic inequality. Back at home, Marcus struggled to adjust to his newfound role as an advocate. Friends and classmates bombarded him with questions, eager to hear his side of the story. Some praised him for handling the situation with grace, while others admitted they didn't know how they would have reacted in his shoes. At times, Marcus appreciated the support. It reminded him that he wasn't alone, but there were moments when the constant attention overwhelmed him, leaving him yearning for the anonymity of his pre-incident life. One evening, as mother and son sat together in their living room, Evelyn noticed the weariness etched on Marcus's face. "You don't have to keep doing interviews if you don't want to," she said gently. "Your voice matters, but your well-being comes first." Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, Mom. It's just, I feel like if I stop talking about it, people might forget, and then nothing will change." Evelyn nodded, understanding his fear. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she replied. "But it starts with stories like yours. You've already inspired so many people. You've given them permission to speak up about their own experiences. That's powerful, Marcus. Don't underestimate the impact you're having. Her words reassured him, even if only slightly. Over time, Marcus learned to balance advocacy with self-care. He continued participating in discussions and events, but he also carved out space for himself. Time to decompress, reflect, and simply exist without the weight of public expectation. This equilibrium helped him regain a sense of normalcy, though he knew his life would never quite return to the way it had been before. As weeks turned into months, the ripple effects of Evelyn's initiatives began to take shape. Employees across Skyline Airlines underwent rigorous diversity training programs led by experts in psychology, sociology, and human behavior. Role-playing scenarios challenged participants to confront their implicit biases head-on, while group discussions encouraged open dialogue about uncomfortable truths. Many walked away from these sessions with fresh perspectives, vowing to approach their jobs with greater awareness and sensitivity. For Captain Richard Hayes, the training proved particularly eye-opening. Sitting in a circle with colleagues, he listened as facilitators shared real-life examples of racial profiling and its devastating consequences. One story struck him especially hard: a young black man detained at an airport because his name resembled someone on a watch list. Though cleared of any wrongdoing, the experience left him traumatized, distrustful of authority figures for years afterward. As Richard absorbed the details, he couldn't help but draw parallels to Marcus's ordeal. The realization hit him. Like a punch to the gut, he had contributed to perpetuating the very cycle he now sought to dismantle. Determined to make amends, Richard volunteered to co-lead a mentorship program aimed at fostering inclusivity among junior pilots. Through candid conversations and shared experiences, he hoped to instill values of empathy and respect in the next generation of aviators. His efforts earned cautious praise from co-workers, who recognized his commitment to personal growth, despite his past mistakes. Outside the airline industry, Evelyn's advocacy sparked broader conversations about systemic racism and privilege. Social media campaigns gained traction, encouraging travelers to share their own stories of discrimination and call for accountability from transportation companies. Influencers and activists joined forces, amplifying marginalized voices and demanding policy reforms. Lawmakers took notice, introducing legislation aimed at combating racial profiling in airports and other public spaces. Despite the progress, challenges persisted. Not everyone welcomed the push for change. Critics accused Evelyn of exploiting her son's experience for publicity, dismissing her efforts as performative activism. Others argued that focusing on individual incidents detracted from addressing larger societal issues. Evelyn acknowledged these criticisms, using them as opportunities to refine her approach. "Criticism is part of the process," she told Marcus during one late-night conversation. "It means people are paying attention, and if they're paying attention, they're engaging, even if it's not always constructive." Marcus nodded, appreciating his mother's wisdom. He had come to understand that fighting for justice wasn't a linear journey. It involved setbacks, compromises, and difficult decisions. What mattered most was staying true to their values and refusing to let adversity silence them. By the 6-month mark, the landscape of aviation began to shift noticeably. Other airlines followed Skyline's lead, adopting similar diversity initiatives and accountability measures. Passengers reported feeling safer and more respected during their travels, thanks to improved interactions with staff. Even small gestures like warmer greetings or attentive service made a difference in restoring trust between customers and carriers. For Evelyn, these developments validated her belief in the power of collective action. She often reflected on how far they had come since that fateful day at the airport. What started as a single act of prejudice had evolved into a movement, a testament to the resilience of those willing to stand up and demand better. As for Marcus, he emerged from the experience stronger and more self-assured. No longer defined solely by the hoodie he wore or the judgments others imposed upon him, he embraced his identity with pride. He knew the fight against racism and bias was far from over, but he also understood that every step forward counted. With his mother by his side, He remained committed to building a world where no one else would have to endure what he did, not because of who they were, but because of how others perceived them. In the end, the incident became more than just a chapter in their lives. It became a catalyst for transformation, proving that even in moments of injustice, hope and progress could prevail. Months after the incident, the ripple effects continued to spread far beyond Marcus and Evelyn's immediate world. The story of a young black teenager wrongfully profiled by a pilot and defended fiercely by his mother, a powerful airline owner, had captured the public's imagination. Social media platforms buzzed with hashtags like Justice for Marcus, Bias-Free Skies, and End Racial Profiling, each one amplifying calls for accountability and reform in industries long plagued by systemic inequities. For Evelyn Carter, this was both heartening and daunting. While she appreciated the groundswell of support, she knew that true change required more than viral outrage. It demanded sustained effort, transparency, and courage. Evelyn threw herself into her advocacy work with renewed vigor. She traveled across the country, speaking at conferences, universities, and community centers. Her presentations weren't just about what had happened to Marcus. They were about dismantling the structures that allowed such incidents to occur in the first place. We live in a society where people are judged not by their actions, but by preconceived notions shaped by stereotypes, she said during one particularly moving speech. If we want to create a fairer world, we must challenge these assumptions, at home, at work, and everywhere in between. Her words resonated deeply with audiences from all walks of life. Young activists saw her as a role model, proof that individuals could wield their influence to drive meaningful change. Industry leaders listened intently, recognizing the need to modernize outdated practices. Even skeptics found themselves swayed by her clarity and conviction. Evelyn's ability to connect with diverse groups stemmed from her authenticity. She spoke not as someone untouchable or infallible, but as a mother who had witnessed her child endure something no parent should ever have to face. Meanwhile, Marcus navigated his new reality with a mix of pride and caution. The spotlight hadn't dimmed completely, and he still received messages daily from strangers thanking him for sharing his story. Some shared their own experiences of racial profiling, while others simply expressed admiration for his resilience. At first, reading these messages overwhelmed him. How could he possibly respond to everyone? But over time, he realized that replying wasn't necessary. It was enough to know that his voice mattered, that it had sparked conversations and inspired action. Still, Marcus struggled with the lingering impact of the incident. There were days when the memory of being singled out on the plane felt distant, almost surreal. And then there were moments when it came rushing back, triggered by something as simple as a suspicious glance from a stranger or an offhand comment from a classmate. On those days, he leaned heavily on his family, particularly his mother. Their bond had deepened through this ordeal, forged in shared pain and mutual determination to rise above it. One evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table, Evelyn noticed Marcus staring absently at his phone. "What's going on?" she asked. Gently, he hesitated before responding. "I got another message today," he admitted. "It was nice, someone saying they're proud of me. But sometimes I wonder if people see me differently now, not just as Marcus, but as that kid who got called out on a plane." Evelyn reached across the table and placed a hand over his. "You're allowed to feel conflicted," she said softly. "People will always project their own ideas onto you. That's human nature. But don't let it define you. You're so much more than this story." Her reassurance helped, though Marcus knew it would take time to fully reconcile his identity with the narrative that had unfolded around him. Back at Skyline Airlines, the diversity initiatives Evelyn had championed were beginning to bear fruit. Employees reported feeling more empowered to speak up about discriminatory behavior, knowing there were systems in place to address their concerns. Passengers, too, noticed subtle yet significant changes. Flight attendants greeted travelers warmly regardless of race or appearance. Security checks became less intrusive and more respectful. and customer service representatives handled complaints with greater empathy. These shifts didn't go unnoticed. Skyline's reputation soared, earning accolades from industry watchdogs and consumers alike. Captain Richard Hayes remained a central figure in the company's transformation. After completing his mandatory diversity training, he took additional steps to educate himself, devouring books and documentaries about racism and privilege. He attended workshops outside of work, seeking guidance from experts and listening intently to colleagues' personal stories. Slowly but surely, he began to dismantle the biases that had once clouded his judgment. Richard also embraced his role as a mentor, guiding junior pilots through the complexities of navigating cultural differences and fostering inclusivity. During one session, he recounted his encounter with Evelyn and Marcus, sparing no detail. "I made a terrible mistake," he admitted, his voice trembling with emotion. "But I'm working every day to learn from it to be better. If my experience can help even one person avoid making the same error, then it'll be worth it." His vulnerability earned him respect among peers, many of whom confessed they had harbored similar biases without realizing it. Together they formed a tight-knit community dedicated to promoting fairness and understanding within the aviation industry. For Richard, this camaraderie marked a turning point, a reminder that growth often begins with humility. Outside the airline sector, Evelyn's efforts inspired broader reforms. Lawmakers introduced legislation aimed at addressing racial profiling in airports and other public spaces. Advocacy groups partnered with transportation companies to develop guidelines for equitable treatment of passengers. Journalists covered these developments extensively, keeping the conversation alive and ensuring accountability remained a priority. Yet despite the progress, resistance persisted. Critics argued that focusing on individual incidents diverted attention from larger societal issues like economic inequality and educational disparities. Others accused Evelyn of grandstanding, suggesting her high-profile status gave her an unfair advantage in pushing for change. While these criticisms stung, Evelyn refused to let them deter her. "Change is messy," she told Marcus during one late-night discussion. "There will always be people who disagree or try to undermine your efforts. What matters is staying focused on the goal." Marcus nodded, drawing strength from her resolve. Over time, he learned to channel his frustration into creativity, using art and writing as outlets for processing his emotions. His sketches depicted scenes of unity and empowerment, images of diverse hands clasped together, silhouettes standing tall against stormy skies. Friends encouraged him to share his artwork online, and soon his pieces gained traction, resonating with viewers who saw echoes of their own struggles in his creations. By the end of the year, the movement sparked by Evelyn and Marcus had transformed into something greater than either of them could have imagined. It wasn't just about addressing racial profiling anymore. It was about reimagining a world where everyone, regardless of background, could move freely and safely without fear of judgment or discrimination. This vision fueled Evelyn's continued advocacy and inspired Marcus to dream bigger than ever before. As 2024 dawned, Evelyn stood on stage at a global aviation summit, addressing a crowd of thousands. "This journey has been humbling," she said, her voice steady and full of purpose. "It has reminded me that while we may never eradicate prejudice entirely, we can build systems and communities that reject it. We owe it to ourselves and to future generations to keep fighting for a world where justice prevails." Her words echoed throughout the auditorium, met with thunderous applause. Beside her, Marcus smiled faintly, knowing how far they had come since that fateful afternoon at the airport. Though scars remained, they served as reminders of resilience and of the power of standing together in the face of injustice. The months following Evelyn's speech at the Global Aviation Summit marked a turning point, not just for Marcus and his family, but for the entire industry. The momentum generated by their story had reached critical mass, sparking conversations that transcended borders and industries. What began as a single incident of racial profiling on an airplane had evolved into a movement with far-reaching implications. People were no longer content to accept the status quo. They demanded accountability, transparency, and tangible change. Evelyn continued to lead the charge, using her platform to advocate for systemic reforms. She partnered with international organizations to draft new standards for equitable treatment in transportation. These guidelines emphasized fairness, respect, and inclusivity, urging companies to prioritize passenger dignity over baseless assumptions. For Evelyn, this was more than professional responsibility. It was personal. Every policy she helped shape was a step toward ensuring that no child, no teenager, would ever have to endure what Marcus had gone through. At Skyline Airlines, the changes implemented under Evelyn's leadership became benchmarks for other carriers. Training programs designed to combat implicit bias expanded beyond employees to include passengers themselves. Flyers received educational materials explaining how unconscious prejudices could harm others, along with tips for fostering mutual respect during travel. Feedback from customers was overwhelmingly positive, with many praising the airline for taking meaningful action rather than issuing empty apologies. Captain Richard Hayes also played a pivotal role in driving these transformations. After completing advanced diversity training, he took it upon himself to mentor not only junior pilots but also airport staff and security personnel. His workshops focused on real-world scenarios, encouraging participants to reflect on their own behaviors and assumptions. "We're all human," Richard often reminded attendees, "and being human means making mistakes. But it's how we learn from those mistakes that defines us." His efforts earned him unexpected recognition. Aviation magazines hailed him as a symbol of redemption, highlighting his journey from error to enlightenment. When asked about this newfound fame, Richard remained humble. "I don't deserve praise. I caused harm," he said during one interview. "But if sharing my story helps even one person avoid repeating my mistakes, then I'll consider it worthwhile." His honesty resonated deeply, inspiring countless individuals to confront their own biases head-on. For Marcus, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, but it was a different kind of normalcy. He still attended school, worked part-time at the cafe, and spent weekends sketching or listening to music. Yet, beneath the surface, he carried a quiet confidence born from surviving adversity, no longer defined solely by the hoodie he wore or the judgments others cast upon him. Marcus embraced his identity fully. He knew who he was, and nothing could take that away. That didn't mean the scars disappeared entirely. There were moments when old fears resurfaced, triggered by seemingly innocuous interactions. A store clerk watching him too closely, a stranger crossing the street to avoid walking past him. Each instance served as a reminder that prejudice wasn't something you could erase overnight. But Marcus had learned to navigate these moments differently now. Instead of letting anger consume him, he channeled it into creativity, pouring his emotions into art and writing. His sketches gained popularity online, where followers praised their raw honesty and power. One piece, titled "Beyond the Hoodie," depicted a young man standing tall against a backdrop of swirling shadows. It became a symbol of resilience, shared widely across social media platforms. Evelyn watched her son's growth with pride, though she never stopped worrying about him. Parenting, she realized, was an endless balancing act between protecting your child and empowering them to face the world. On nights when Marcus seemed particularly quiet, she'd sit beside him, offering silent support. "You've got this," she'd say softly, knowing he needed to hear those words, even if he already believed them deep down. As the year progressed, Evelyn's advocacy expanded beyond aviation. She collaborated with educators to develop curricula aimed at teaching students about racial equity and cultural sensitivity. Schools across the country adopted these programs, integrating lessons on empathy and inclusion into classrooms. Teachers reported noticeable shifts in student behavior, kids learning to celebrate differences rather than fear them. For Evelyn, seeing young minds open up to new perspectives reaffirmed her belief in the power of education to dismantle prejudice. Meanwhile, Marcus found his voice growing stronger. Invitations poured in for him to speak at events, share his story, and join panels discussing youth activism. At first he hesitated, unsure if he wanted to relive the pain publicly. But Evelyn encouraged him to embrace the opportunity, reminding him of the impact his words could have. "Your voice matters," she told him repeatedly. "Not because of what happened to you, but because of how you choose to respond." When Marcus finally agreed to participate in a panel discussion hosted by a prominent civil rights organization, he surprised even himself. Standing before an audience of hundreds, he spoke candidly about his experience, the humiliation, the frustration, the anger. But he also talked about hope. The hope ignited by his mother's unwavering support, the hope sparked by strangers reaching out with messages of solidarity, and the hope that someday, stories like his wouldn't dominate headlines because such incidents would cease to exist. The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing throughout the auditorium. As Marcus stepped off stage, Evelyn greeted him with tears in her eyes. "You did it," she whispered, pulling him into a tight hug. Marcus smiled, feeling lighter than he had in months. Sharing his truth hadn't erased the past, but it had given him a sense of closure, a way to reclaim control over his narrative. By the end of 2024, the landscape of aviation, and society at large, had shifted significantly. Airlines worldwide adopted stricter anti-profiling policies, while governments introduced legislation to hold institutions accountable for discriminatory practices. Social media campaigns celebrating diversity gained traction, amplifying marginalized voices and challenging stereotypes. Even small victories like passengers treating flight attendants with greater kindness or travelers extending courtesy to one another signaled progress. Yet Evelyn and Marcus understood that the fight was far from over. Bias and prejudice were deeply entrenched issues, requiring constant vigilance and effort to address. Still, they approached the future with optimism, knowing they weren't alone in this battle. Together, they had built a network of allies, friends, colleagues, activists, all united by a shared vision of justice and equality. One evening, as they sat together on their porch watching the sunset, Evelyn turned to Marcus with a thoughtful expression. "Do you remember how scared you felt that day at the airport?" she asked. Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Yeah," he replied quietly, "but I also remember how strong I felt afterward, like nothing could break me." Evelyn smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "That's exactly who you are, Marcus. Strong, resilient, unstoppable." Her words lingered in the air, carried by the gentle breeze. For both mother and son, the journey ahead promised challenges, but it also promised opportunities to continue shaping a better, fairer world. In the end, the incident that had once seemed like a devastating blow had become a catalyst for transformation. It taught Marcus and Evelyn that even in moments of injustice, there was power in standing together. Their story wasn't just about survival, it was about rising above, about turning pain into purpose. And as they looked toward the future, hand in hand, they knew they had already made an indelible mark on the world.